So welcome everyone to another episode of Philosopher Meets Critics, a roundtable discussion organized by the Federal University of Bahia and Concept, the Cologne Center for Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian Tradition. And I'm very happy to meet again this soon because we already taped a meeting on last Friday. We presented Annalisa Koliva with her book Extended Rationality, which is already available on our YouTube channel called Figments of the Brain. So just look for Figments of the Brain on YouTube and you'll find the first 2 episodes of Philosopher Meets Critics. And today I'm very happy to present Sandy Goldberg. Sandy is at Northwestern University and his research mainly focuses on epistemology and the philosophy of mind and language. And today he will present his book Conversational Pressure, published in 2020 by Oxford University Press. And today we don't only have 3 critics, but we have 4. So Sandy, you have a lot to respond to today. Welcome Amy Flowerree from Texas Tech University, Breno Santos from the Federal University of Mato Grosso, Rik Peels from the Free University of Amsterdam, or VU Amsterdam, and Charity Anderson from Baylor University. So again, we will start with a short presentation by Sandy, and afterwards we will dive into the comment section. And Sandy, you are happily invited to respond to each comment afterwards. So thank you, please start.
Thanks so much. I first want to thank you, Isabel, and also the folks at Concept in Cologne for this lovely invitation. I want to thank my 4 commentators for spending the time and the thoughtfulness that you brought to this. I do wonder whether the fact that there are 4 commentators means that this is particularly rich in objectionable content, which may well be the case, in which case the challenge is going to be even greater, but we'll see. So for my life outside of philosophy, I have always been obsessed with conversations and the nature of conversations. And one of the things that has obsessed me is the idea that conversations are an interesting way in which we exert kinds of pressure on one another. And when I looked at the philosophical literature, I didn't see a lot of explicit theorizing about this kind of pressure. The kind of pressure that I have in mind ranges from things like when I talk to you, I expect that you're going to attend to me. When you talk to me, you expect that I'm going to attend to you, to such things as when I make demands on you, you then are in a position where there's pressure on you either to do what I've demanded you do, or to feel the kind of awkwardness that arises when a demand goes unmet. What I wanted to do in this book was to theorize about this kind of pressure, in particular to see if I could characterize it in clear ways and do so using a minimal number of tools. In particular, I use Grice's assumption of cooperativity in conversation, the cooperative principle, and then ordinary tools of speech act theory. And I wanted to use these because I wanted to see whether or not I could bring some order to the various forms of conversational pressure using just these minimal tools. Now, I should say a thing about what I mean by conversational pressure in the book. What I have in mind is normative pressure, the pressure of the demands of answering to norms or standards. And in the book, I tried to do 3 main things. First of all, I want to try to clarify the types and sources of these norms, if you like, normativity in conversation. Second, I wanted to address what I see as some confusions in the literature that arise in part because of what I see as faulty theorizing about the norms and the sources of norms in conversation. And here I would highlight 3 main areas of what struck me as confusions. First, what speakers are entitled to expect from their audiences. Second, confusions about the very nature of the speech acts of asserting and telling. And third, confusions that arise in the demands that come when a friend tells us something, so-called partiality in friendship. But the third main thing, besides clarifying the types and sources of normativity in conversation and addressing what I see as some confusions in the literature, I also wanted to highlight what I see as some really underappreciated aspects or under-theorized aspects of normativity in conversation. This, I will confess, was perhaps my my favorite part to think about while I was writing the book, because I saw a variety of things in conversation that involve normative pressure where there isn't much, at least in the philosophical literature. Here I talk about, for example, the act of addressing another person. There's a little bit on this. What little you find on this is mainly in the ethics literature, a little bit in speech act theory. Secondly, the idea that conversational silence itself is something that answers to normative demands. There's perhaps the longest chapter of the book is on conversational silence. Third, it struck me that the extensive literature on silencing, which actually is quite extensive, still underdescribes the variety of harms that arise when someone is silenced in conversation. Fourth, what I describe in a chapter as the strange rationality of belief polarization. It turns out, on my view, belief polarization in some respects is actually not an irrational or irrational process, but is actually driven by rational considerations. And I wanted to point out what those considerations were. And then finally, what I regard as some underappreciated epistemic costs of politeness in conversation. We think of politeness as a good. What I wanted to point out was that there are some underappreciated costs. In the few minutes that I have remaining, what I'd like to do is just go over some of the main claims that I make in these areas. So again, let me start with the first of the three main things that I wanted to do, clarifying the types and sources of normativity in conversation, so-called normative pressures. In the book, I talk about two main types, epistemic and interpersonal. Epistemic pressure is the kind of pressure that is exerted on one when one is answerable to the norms or standards of epistemology. And it's not hard to see why these kinds of demands might arise in conversation, in particular, when people tell us things or when people make statements or assertions. Those are claims that purport to say how things are. And then there is a kind of demand on the audience to respond to those claims in ways that conform to the standards of epistemology, if you like, the standards of belief formation. This is a very, very well-known point in epistemology. The entirety of the epistemology of testimony is on this. And I thought that this is one of the reasons why I focused a bit on speech acts like telling and asserting in this book. But epistemic norms or epistemic standards, epistemic pressures are not the only kind of pressure there is in conversation. Recently, or not so recently, largely owing to the literature in feminist philosophy of language and also critical race theory, there has been a lot of attention that's being paid to the interpersonal nature of conversations and the kinds of standards or norms that there are often violated when, for example, the speaker is a member of an underrepresented or oppressed group. Here I have in mind the kind of claim that Miranda Fricker is famous for having brought to our attention in her very well-known 2007 book, Epistemic Injustice, where the idea is that if you are a speaker, you are entitled to expect a certain kind of treatment from your audience, what I call proper treatment. And then audiences that fail to give you that proper treatment have harmed you. And she focuses on a specific kind of case of this sort, which she calls a case of epistemic injustice, in particular testimonial injustice, when people don't give you the credibility that is your due, and they downgrade you not in virtue of your past track record, but in virtue of your status as a member of a group against which they have prejudices. I wanted to group this kind of pressure under the big category of interpersonal pressure. Interpersonal pressure can be of various sorts. So Fricker in her book talks about the justice. We can imagine that there are kinds of pressures that come from ethics. That's also an interpersonal kind of pressure. For example, the mandate not to lie is actually, if you like, an interpersonal kind of pressure on speakers. It happens to be a moral pressure, don't lie. But we can also imagine non-moral but interpersonal pressures on people. For example, this was something that I discussed in the chapter, friendship. When a friend tells you something, there might well be norms of friendship, of how we treat friends, that exert a kind of pressure on us, and that pressure can bear on how we respond to their speech. I'll say that I mentioned those two kinds of pressures, epistemic and interpersonal. The one kind of pressure I didn't mention, but which actually does play a role here, is speech act theoretic pressure or norms. As I said at the very outset, I try to appeal to Speech Act norms in order to understand how these various forms of pressure bear against us, either as speakers or as hearers. But the two that I really focus on and that I highlight are epistemic and interpersonal. That then is the first of the main things that I wanted to try to do in the book, was to clarify the types and sources of normativity in conversation. The second, as I mentioned earlier, is I wanted to address what I see as some real confusions in the literature. And confusions in particular having to do with what speakers are entitled to expect from audiences. This is a topic that's been very, very discussed in the literature, in particular the literature on epistemic injustice, but not just there. And before weighing in on this topic, what I wanted to do is I wanted to clarify what I thought a good theory ought to tell us about what speakers are entitled to expect from audiences. And I tried to motivate what I called 5 desiderata, five things that any good theory really should try to answer or to address. The first is what I call the scope problem. What are the range of speech acts that require this kind of proper treatment? Some people think they're sayings broadly, others restricted to assertions or statements, still others restricted further to tellings or testifyings. What is the range or scope of speech acts requiring this treatment? Second, what is it that entitles a speaker to expect proper treatment? That strikes me as one of the more difficult questions to answer. Why, for example, when you tell me something, are you entitled to expect certain things of me as your audience member? That's also something we want to be able to answer. Third, what I call the content of the expectation. What is it that you're entitled to expect of me when you tell me something? What's interesting to my mind is that I see a variety of different answers here. I see some people who say that what you're entitled to expect of me is to be believed. I see other people who say what you're entitled to expect of me is to be presumed trustworthy. And I see other people saying still other things. My question is, which of these things is the right thing to think when we try to understand what a speaker is entitled to expect of her audience? Fourth, still thinking about the, if you like, still thinking about the kind of answers we want to be able to offer when we're thinking about a speaker's expectation of being treated properly by her audience. The fourth thing is, what is the nature of the wrong that an audience does to a speaker when the audience violates the expectation of proper treatment? As I pointed out, somebody like Miranda Fricker points out that this can be an injustice, and she talks about it as an intrinsic wrong, or wrong against the person in her status as a knower. That's a question that I want to be able to answer. What is the nature of the wrong? And then finally, how does all of this theorizing, this fancy theorizing about speech acts and speech exchanges, how does all of this fit in with the epistemology of testimony, an area of growth in the epistemology itself? So that then, if you like, is the first part of what I was trying to address as confusions in the literature. What exactly are speakers entitled to expect from their audiences? There's a second area where I think I discerned a lot of confusion in the literature, and that has to do with if you think about the act of telling or asserting as actually somehow the act in which you get to have these kinds of expectations, what is the nature of this act of asserting or telling? And I think I've discerned at least 6 different answers in the literature, some of which have received a tremendous amount of attention, others of which have received almost no attention, but which in my mind are actually quite interesting. There is what I call the demand model. This is a model that's presented by Alan Gibbard. His idea is that when I tell you something, I demand to be believed. So telling or asserting is a kind of demand to be believed. There is what I call the advising model. This is owed to Mike Ridge at the University of Edinburgh. Ridge's idea is that when I assert something to you, I advise you to believe me. It's a kind of advising act. There's a very familiar, perhaps overly familiar, proposal model. This is owed to, of course, Bob Stalnaker. His model of assertion is that assertion is a proposal to update the common ground by adding the proposition asserted. So you can think of an assertion as a kind of proposal. You and I are engaged in a conversation, and I propose we update in a certain kind of way. That's what it is to assert. In addition to these 3 models, there are 3 other models that I explored. There's one that's owed to Ted Hinchman, the invitation to trust model. When I tell you something, it's really a matter of my inviting you to trust me. There's the promising model. This is owed to Tim Scanlon. Scanlon says his point is that you can think of my telling you something as kind of my offering you a promise, namely that you can rely on me. I promise that you can rely on me. So telling you is a matter of stating something as being the case, but also as a way indicating to you that I promise you that you can rely on me. And a very related theory is the sixth theory, Richard Moran's theory, which is the guarantee model. To tell someone something is to offer them a kind of guarantee. So he's interested in trying to capture the idea that when I give you my word, what am I actually doing? I'm guaranteeing that what I say is true, or that I have the evidence to back it up. So these are 6 different models for the speech act of assertion or the speech act of telling: the demanding model, the advising model, the proposal model, the invitation to trust model, the promising model, and the guarantee model. I actually think that none of them taken individually can actually do all that we want. But I think that many of them have actually interesting insights, especially those that have been neglected in the literature. Here I have in mind Gibbard's demanding model in particular. They have interesting insights, and what I try to do in one of my chapters is offer my favorite theory that tries to capture the insights of the models that I like without having the problems of the models as I criticize them. So that's the second of the 2 areas where I try to address some confusions in the literature: what speakers are entitled to expect from audiences, the nature of the speech act of, if you like, asserting or telling. And then the third area where I think I discern some confusions in the literature is in the area of friendship, in friendship trust, and the idea that somehow friendship can demand trust from us. That strikes me as a confusion. And what I wanted to try to do is use some of the tools that I used for my earlier discussions to try to diagnose exactly what friendship demands of us, why it might seem to us that friendship can demand trust, and how we should better theorize about that. So that's the third of the areas that where there were confusions in the literature, or at least I allege there are confusions in the literature. Let me, in the last comments that I want to make, let me just dwell for a few minutes with you on what I told you is my favorite part to think about, which is certain underappreciated aspects of normativity in conversation. These were fun to think about in part because independent of being a philosopher, I tend to get obsessed about these things. And so the thought that I might be able to bring some illumination with the tools of philosophy actually delighted me. I don't know whether I actually have illuminated them or just made a mess of things. But several topics I want to highlight to your attention. First is the act of address. So when I address you, I wanted to know what exactly goes on when one person addresses another. And my guiding thought was this: the very act of address is much more significant when it comes to the kinds of pressures that there are in conversation than it strikes me the literature has recognized. And that's because it's in the act of address that I exert pressure on you to enter into what is a normatively structured space, the space of a conversation. So it's by addressing you that I kind of put a demand on you to pay attention to me. And you do the same back to me when you address me. And what I was trying to figure out is, how is it that merely by addressing you, I could properly be regarded as having placed a demand on you, namely a demand that you pay attention to what it is that I want to communicate to you. And what is it that enables you to do the same to me? And the thesis that I tried to argue for was that when an address is part of a cooperative attempt to initiate a cooperative activity with another person, the very act of addressing another person generates a reason for the addressee to attend to the one who addressed her, where that reason stems from the very cooperativity that is presumed in the act of conversation. So my thought was that if we are going to be cooperative creatures, we're social creatures, if we're going to cooperate with one another, we need a way to capture each other's attention. But not just to capture each other's attention, but as it were, to demand that attention, at least for a short period of time, short enough for the demander to make clear what it is that is being proposed. And that it's the act of address that enables us to make that demand. And I tried to say why I think that demand itself could be understood as deriving from the cooperative or the presumptively cooperative nature of conversations. And I also talked about the conditions under which addresses do not actually generate a reason for others to attend to you. Those are cases when For example, the address is clearly not a matter of cooperation. I'm just trying to get your attention, but I don't really intend to cooperate with you. There are all sorts of cases like this, and I try to talk about the range of those kinds of cases. Second area where I thought things were under-theorized, conversational silence. This one is an interesting one. I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't already know when I tell you that conversational silence is often extremely significant. It's often a contribution to a conversation. That strikes me as a point that everyone will recognize. And yet when you look at the literature, there isn't all that much, at least in the philosophy literature. There's in linguistics, in conversational analysis, in other areas of that theorize about conversations, there's a lot. In philosophies, there's not very much. There is a little bit, and what little bit there is strikes me as deficient, but as deficient in a way that can be built upon. And here I talk about Philip Pettit has a paper from the couple of decades ago where he talks about silence. And his thought was that silence can actually be meaningful in Grice's sense. It can actually have Gricean or speaker meaning. And I point out that I think that's too strong. That my thought is that the significance of conversational silence can but doesn't have to take the form of Gricean speaker meaning. And so what I tried to do is I tried to argue instead for a different model. My model went something like this. When a speech exchange is cooperative, audience members are presumptively entitled to presume that there's no silent rejection of another person's assertion. That entitlement, the entitlement to assume that people who are silent haven't rejected, that has as its source the presumption of cooperativity in conversation, together with the marked or dispreferred nature of rejection. Those two things together are the source of the entitlement to presume no silent rejection. And what this means is that if you are part of a public conversation and you are observed to remain silent in the face of a publicly made assertion, that under normal conditions, other people will be entitled to presume that you haven't rejected the assertion. And what I try to do is I try to say this is enough to suggest one way that conversational silence can make a contribution to conversations that doesn't require conversational silence to be a part of Gricean speaker meaning. I go on to argue that the entitlement to assume that silence is not, that the silent person has not rejected the assertion, that entitlement itself is defeasible. There are two circumstances where it's defeated, either where you have reason to think that the speech exchange isn't cooperative, or when the reason to presume no silent rejection is outweighed by the audiences having other reasons that are stronger, which reasons are reasons to remain silent. And I try to make sense of this as well, what kind of reasons those might be, and how we as audience members who are observing other audience members, how we can be sensitive to the kinds of reasons that we each have for perhaps remaining silent. But all of this is interesting to me in part because I think if my theory is right, it underwrites something that's not quite a duty to speak up, but something in the ballpark of a duty to speak up when you disagree. So I find that interesting just because I think this is a topic that's worth thinking about. And if I'm right about this, the duty to speak up may actually derive from the cooperative features of conversation rather than requiring any specifically ethical, if you like, theorizing. So the duty comes from what we're entitled to expect of one another in conversation, specific to conversation. Finally, three other areas. These I'm not going to go into detail. I find that the recent literature on silencing is actually quite interesting, and I think that some of the things that I say about conversational silence can be imported into the silencing literature to suggest that when people are silenced as conversational partners, that actually has more harm, that does more harm to them than many theories recognize. Again, I also point out that the process of belief polarization in conversation, the process whereby when I talk to like-minded people, I might become more extreme in my views, even though there's no new evidence, nobody's sharing any new evidence beyond the fact that other people are expressing their agreement with me. I try to argue that process may actually be, in a strange kind of way, more rational than we think. It's an interesting kind of irony of things. And then finally, I talk about the epistemic costs of politeness, costs that go beyond what you might recognize as those costs. And in a nutshell, my thought is that when you are in a community that has strong politeness norms, that saps the strength of conversational silence to be particularly significant. And that I try to argue that actually is a cost to efficient conversations that we ought to acknowledge. Maybe that doesn't say that we shouldn't be, that doesn't say we should be impolite, but it's just the cost to be acknowledged. So with that, I just want to wrap up. This was a lovely chance for me to present my work to really four wonderful thinkers, and I'm really excited to listen to what they have to say in criticism or in just on the things that I've talked about here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you very much. Breno, would you like to give the first comment?
Sure. I can do that. Thank you. Thank you, Silvio. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you to everyone at the University of Cologne, at Concept, the Federal University of Bahia as well. And Sandy for writing such a lovely book, a great book that, to my estimation, is already a classic for those who are interested in testimony, assertion, and all these issues that you talk about in the book. I want to stick to my time, so I'm going to stick to my notes so I don't go over 10 minutes. I want to comment briefly on two elements of the book that you discuss. The first one is on the topic of epistemic partiality and in friendship, and the second one on the topic of silence and the expectation of no silent rejection. So first, I'd like to air some concerns about the epistemic reasons. They are supposed to be at play both in cases of S telling something to her good friend A, and in the case of A hearing from a third party something about her good friend's behavior or character. So it seems to me that it can be argued that the value reflecting epistemic reasons involved in the second case, the case where one hears about one's friend from a third party, are not really epistemic reasons. So in the first case, S has friendship generated value reflecting practical reasons to speak truly with her friend A, and to avoid risking the friendship by inviting A to trust her unwarrantedly. And A also has epistemic reasons of the same type to give an appropriate response to this invitation to trust. So when S is worthy of trust and A fails to respond positively to S's invitation to trust, A damages the friendship. In the second case, the one that doesn't involve the friend say so, A has a friendship generated value reflecting reason to, when confronted with some report or information about her friend, avoid risking the friendship by falsely believing something ill or something bad about her friend, or failing to truly believe something good about her friend. I take it that your case against partiality hangs on the proper transition from value reflecting practical reasons to value reflecting epistemic reasons. So in the first case, you argue that this transition is made possible by the mutual knowledge that S and A have about each other's intention to preserve the friendship. So from this knowledge, S and A acquire epistemic reasons that the friend will act on their friendship generated value reflecting practical reasons. So the reason then that moves A to epistemically behave in a particular way when A's friend says so is involved is an epistemic reason. So there's no partiality in this case. But I'm not sure that we can proceed with a similar transition of reasons in the second case, when the conversation is not with a friend, but with a third party talking about one's friend. In the first case, S and A share an epistemic pressure generated by the mutual recognition that both are committed to avoid risking the friendship, either by an inappropriate invitation to trust or inappropriate response to this invitation. But it doesn't seem that there's anything of epistemic substance being shared in the second case, given that S is not inviting A to trust her, and A is not responding to S's invitation and all the practical commitments that come with it. So in the absence of this shared knowledge, we seem to lose the differential flavor of A's epistemic behavior. We are left with the general standard epistemic reasons to believe truly and not believe falsely, for example. The only additional reasons that A has seem to be practical. For example, A doesn't want to be unfair to a person that she cares about, and A doesn't want to cause damage to her esteem for this person. A quick side note here, even if A's friend never finds out about the way A reacted to the third-party report, and so the friendship is not in jeopardy, A still have practical reasons to avoid being unfair and to avoid damaging the esteem she has for the friend. In sum, A doesn't have additional epistemic reasons to treat her friend's interests in a way that is more demanding than A would normally do. But A has a few friendship-generated value reflecting practical reasons to do so. So if that's correct, epistemic partiality in friendship stands in the second case, but not in the first case. Conversely, we can see how in the first case, there are new epistemic reasons being added up to A's total evidence. Since A has knowledge, in the first case, A has knowledge of the tacit agreement to preserve the friendship. So A's reason, the first case, to give a positive spin or to avoid a bad one to her friend say so, are value reflecting epistemic reasons. In response to this point that I just made, one could appeal to A's deep background knowledge of her friend's character or behavior to argue for a differential epistemic treatment. But I don't think this will work. Because I think that the type of reason that we are looking for here is one generated by the force of the practical pressure, not by the force of the epistemic considerations alone. We are looking for friendship-generated, value-reflecting epistemic reasons, not evidence-generated, evidence-reflecting epistemic reasons. So if this is correct, the case involving a third party fails to escape the charge of partiality on non-epistemic terms. So I would appreciate if you could comment on that, these things that I brought up. My second comment, and I want to be quick on this one so I don't go over my time, is on the disaggregation objection and the idea that we should evaluate our expectation to the claim of no silent rejection on a case-by-case basis. I don't mean to defend the objection here, but I want to offer some considerations related to this objection. So the first is related to the way group membership or group allegiance could perhaps be a problem for NSR, no silent rejection. I'm thinking specifically of cases where it is not clear whether the fulfillment of NSR should be attributed to a person as a reflection of their own personal acceptance or as a reflection of the acceptance as a member of a group. Take the case, for example, of deliberation via democratic centralism. In Leninist political parties, deliberation usually takes the form of a free and fair democratic debate that, if successful, leads to a consolidated group position. This position is the one that each and every member of the party must enforce or avoid to deny in public forums, even if one doesn't agree with the position with the party position, even if one was the proponent of the defeated contrary position, for example, but still strongly believes in it. Now consider that after deliberation, Vlado, a member of the party, is having dinner with some political figures, of which only one is a comrade, a member of the party, a high-ranking comrade. This comrade argues that all workers should strive to build strong and massive labor strikes to stop production as soon as possible. But Vlado disagrees. He defended a considerably milder position during the party's deliberation process. And he was defeated. But as a good Leninist, he opts to stay silent in the face of his comrade's assertion. After all, as a member of the party, he should avoid publicly rejecting the party's position on important issues. So, as a member of the party, he does not reject his comrade and party's position. And one could even say that, as a person who abides to the centralist principle, he accepts the position. But as an individual, however, he's inclined to strongly reject it, but he stays silent. From this example, one could say that his personal responses to what is being discussed should not matter, since he's representing his party at the dinner table. We could think, though, of different versions of this example where this doesn't have to be the case. My point in summary is that the clash between personal acceptance and group membership or group allegiance might complicate matters related to NSR. In one important sense, there's nothing problematic here, since NSR is a claim about what is the default expectation one is allowed to have when one faces silence in a cooperative conversation. But in another smaller sense, this way of constructing the claim, the NSR claim, might hide important distinctions within our social ontologies. Another small example of how matters can be complicated can be found in Alessandra Tanesini's discussion of eloquent silences, especially in her discussion on how the silences can give rhythm to conversations. When one hesitates before speaking, for example, one might be communicating something more or different from acceptance. One silent pause in a conversation might be a way of intentionally communicating that one is still thinking about what to say. The silence of one's interlocutor, on the other hand, as in the silent waiting for the other person's words, stands as evidence that one's intention was properly communicated to another person. According to Tanesini, this is a silent dialogue in which one person asks for more time before speaking and the other person silently accedes to the request. To conclude, an interesting question on this score is how do we, as a society, discipline this type of silence, this type of eloquent silence? Is there a time limit for the eloquent silence? At which point the eloquent silence can be interrupted or it becomes a sign of acceptance? Is there a clear normative distinction between omissive silence, one, for example, the silence of a typical of acceptance, for example, and deliberate silence, a silence that means, for example, that one is not comfortable with the type of conversation that's going on. So, and what is the place of awkward silence in the NSR framework? So these questions might be of interest not only to those who are arguing for NSR, but also to those who, like yourself, are interested in the social and political constraints of NSR. Given that way of regulating silences, if there are any, might be connected to social power and to social identities. So if you'd like to comment on that as well, it's not an objection, but maybe some considerations that might be interesting for the topic of silence, I'll be happy to hear about it. So sorry if I exceeded my time, and thank you.
Breno, thank you so much. That was really, really thoughtful. I appreciate that. You raised two issues. Let me see if I can speak to both of them. The first was with respect to epistemic partiality. And your worry, which is a really lovely, lovely worry, is that there's a difference in friendship cases from the case, we'll call this the first personal case where a friend tells you, you got to believe me, I'm not guilty of this, versus the third person case where somebody else tells you, you know, your friend isn't guilty of this or something like this. You're right about one thing. These two cases are very different and they should be treated differently. And I hope in the book I actually did treat them differently. You point out, and I want to agree with you, that when a friend tells you something, it looks like, when a friend says to you, you got to believe me, it looks like the very act by which the friend tells you that gives you additional reasons, relatively strong reasons to believe the friend. But that those are absent when it's a third party that tells you these things. I think you're right about that. What that suggests is that my theory makes a prediction, which is we're going to have two normatively different cases. And I think that prediction is correct. I don't think that's a bug. I actually think that's, what do they call that? Not a bug, but a feature. Let me point out that you put your finger on only one part of what I wanted to do with the duties or the norms of friendship. You pointed out that I want to suggest that the norms of friendship, where we both value the friendship and we recognize that we value the friendship, when the friend talks to you about something, the friend, let me step back for 1 second, just to give the big framework, because I don't know that everyone read the book. What I wanted to say about friendship is something that's a special case of a much more general phenomenon. The phenomenon has to do with how we treat things that we value. When you value something, you have practical reasons to preserve it and promote it and protect it, and do what you can to avoid ruining it. So my thought was, that's what friendship is. Friendship gives you practical reasons, not epistemic reasons, but practical reasons to do what you can to protect the friendship. My thought was that when in cases of testimony, you have these practical reasons. So a friend who tells you something has practical reasons to tell you the truth, lest in lying to you, she or he is damaging the friendship. And you as the audience have practical reasons to do what you can to make sure that you are never in a situation where you believe something false and awful of your friend, or disbelieve something true and nice of your friend. So you should do what you can to make sure you're never in that situation. So what I said was, these two cases, the first person case and the third person case, are going to be different, because in the first person case, you have exactly the kind of pressures that you, Breno, talked about. Namely, when you tell me I didn't do it, and I recognize that you value our friendship, and I take it that you're valuing our friendship gives you strong practical reason not to lie to me, that itself becomes an epistemic reason for me to believe you. But notice, that's not the only pressure that there is. If I, as an audience member, I'm under pressure never to be in a situation where I believe falsely something bad of you, or disbelieve something that's good of you, but which is true, I don't want to be in that situation. That puts me under practical pressure to go and get more evidence. When it looks like I run that risk, I'm under practical pressure to go get more evidence. And that's the second part of my account. What I think is going on in friendship cases is that there is a kind of partiality, but it's not the kind of partiality that makes me violate epistemic standards. It's the kind of partiality that says, if you're going to believe something bad about your friend, you better be awfully confident. And what that means is go get more evidence. But go get more evidence. You can believe according to the right normal standards, but you should get more evidence to make sure you don't believe prematurely. That's the idea. So that's what's going on in the third person case, and I think that's my account of what's going on in the third person case. Let me just quickly say a couple things about silence. You raise a couple of really nice points about my treatment of silence. The first is you suggest, wait a second, under conditions in which people are members of groups, and they may well be, as it were, silent as a member of a group, but not as an individual, things get complicated. To which I want to say, you're absolutely right. I think you're quite right about that. My thought is this: when you are a member of a group, typically, especially in your case of Leninist politics, it will be common knowledge that you are a member of a group. And that very common knowledge will, in fact, give us what I called an outweighing reason, a reason that is weightier than the reason that we have to think that your silence indicates acceptance. Namely, we now have a reason to think that your silence may well indicate your acceptance as a member of the group rather than your private acceptance. So my thought is, you can handle cases where there's a difference between, if you like, the public, the acceptance a person has as a member of a group and her private acceptance. What you have to do is you have to build in the assumption that it's common knowledge that you are a member of this group, and how, as a member of a group, you ought to act. You raise one other point that I really like a lot, which is what to do about omissive silence versus deliberative silence versus awkward silence, and how to think about the kind of case that Alessandra Tonassini brought to our attention in what she called eloquent silence. I think these are fabulous questions. To be candid, I'm not sure that what I said in the book actually gives me something that makes nice, sharp predictions in all these cases. So I think you're right to put pressure on this. But I think with a little extension, I can probably say a little bit. And let me just be brief here. So when we think about how we interpret the conversational silence of a partner, of a conversational partner, what we have to do is we have to bring in all of our relevant background information. And if you think about this in terms of, if you like the Stolnacker model, you have to think about all the things that are part of the common ground. And all those things that are part of the common ground are presumably going to be things having to do with the way in which we signal what we might intend with our silence, or whether we're signaling anything with our silence. So consider the following. I hypothesize, and in fact, yesterday, Peter Graham and I were on a dissertation defense were at a dissertation defense when someone was making comments of this kind, I speculate that we have some more or less conventional ways to signal to people when our silence is a matter of a request for further time to think about things. And that you and I are particularly good at discerning when that signal has been presented to us. So my guess is that this is an empirical claim and I could well be wrong about this, but my guess is that if you and I, and by you I mean anyone in the Zoom room, were to look at a scene of two people interacting with each other where there are silences in the conversation, we would be awfully good at interpreting the silences. And my speculation is that that's because we have more or less conventional ways, or at least widely recognized ways of signaling when we want more time. I think Alessandra's cases are a lot like this. I'd have to think about this more, but I suspect that those eloquent silences, you can tell when I'm just thinking about what to say, as opposed to when I'm just passively acknowledging that what you said it can pass for accepted. And what I'd like to say is that that's the way we're going to interpret all silences. Awkward silences are awkward precisely because we have reasons to think that there's something unusual going on there. You know, that Goldberg guy, he just doesn't know how to behave in conversation. He's very awkward. When that becomes common knowledge about that Goldberg guy, you now have a reason to think that his silences may actually not be significant in the way that my theory predicts. But what my theory predicts is, in the absence of these special reasons, when you have no special reasons, the no silent rejection assumption is nevertheless going to be salient and default. That's what my theory predicts, and that's a prediction that I stand by. So with that, let me thank you, Breno, very, very much, and I would love to continue with you later on so that you can tell me if you have some follow-ups or things that you find doubtful in what I said. I'd love to hear about them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Rik, would you like to go next?
Yes, I would like to go next. Thank you so much. I would like to start by thanking the people from the University of Cologne, so Sibel and Valdomiro in particular, for organizing this splendid event in these challenging times. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank Sandy, of course, for his splendid book. I noticed that I think it has not been shown yet, so let me show the book. There it is, Conversational Pressure. It's a terrific book. If you watch this on YouTube, go and buy the book. You'll learn a lot from it, at least I did. So thank you so much, Sandy. I loved reading this book. It's crisp and clear as your writings always are. So thank you so much. I actually also had a slide with a summary in my presentation, but I think it's ridiculous to think that I could summarize the book better than you can. So I'll just skip the summary and go straight away to my comments or thoughts and questions about the book. But before I do so, a couple of things that I consider to be virtues about your book. So 4 things that come to mind. One thing that I love is that you try to dissolve the alleged conflict between interpersonal duties on the one hand, or norms and epistemic duties on the other hand. And I think you found a way to do so. So I think that's terrific. Dissolving alleged conflict. Also, I think it doesn't commit us to uniqueness or to permissivism. And it might have been tempting to go that way. So I think that's another great virtue of the book. I really like the fact that it also takes on board the wrongs committed or possibly committed when information comes from a third party. I think that's certainly a virtue, and lots of accounts cannot do that. And finally, I really like the fact that it applies to lots of different kinds of practical circumstances. And by that I mean situations of silence and friendship and the particular norms or specific reasons, practical reasons that friendships bring along. So those are a couple of things I love about the book. There are more than those, but for time's sake, I'll leave it at this and move to some more critical questions. All right, so I've got 3 critical questions for you at this stage, and I'll mostly zoom in on chapters 4, 5, and 6 in doing so. So first, exactly what is the proper dixastic response according to you when someone asserts something to someone else? So I think you use a couple of different phrases in the book, and I'm still a little bit confused about exactly what you have in mind. So sometimes you say, when someone asserts something, that person deserves of trust with regard to that proposition. Sometimes you say one should be careful before disbelieving that piece. Sometimes you use the phrase should accept that piece. And I think there are slight differences between each of these phrases. So I wondered whether I would like to suggest that really one of the things that can probably be expected once one is in a position to know something and one asserts that P to someone else, the proper response really is belief and not merely acceptance, right? So I would feel wronged if someone accepted P, so took it for granted in his or her practical and theoretical reasoning that P, without actually being convinced that P is true. When I say to someone, I went to university yesterday, and that person accepts it but doesn't believe it, I feel something has gone wrong. And that means that suspension of judgment would also be a wrong in some cases, not merely disbelief, right? So if a person suspends judgment on whether I went to university yesterday, if I sincerely assert that I did, I know that I did. And I would like to go even a step further and suggest that a proper response involves the right sort or the proper degree of belief. So if I assert something along those lines and that person is barely convinced, I think something has gone wrong. So wouldn't it be proper to add that belief is the proper response, but also belief to the right sort of degree, right? And so that depends on all sorts of practical factors. That's the first question I wanted to ask you. The second question has to do with friendship and epistemic partiality. So I would like to follow up on a couple of things there. So here you say, at some point, page 133, you say, from this, we surmise that S has friendship generated value affecting practical reasons to avoid lying or speaking unwarrantedly. In general, these reasons will be stronger in accordance with the degree to which S values the friendship. And I think that is actually right. But I expected you to make a different move from the move you're making here in the book. So I thought you would say at this stage in the book, since the practical stakes are high and there's more practical reason not to lie to your friend rather than a stranger, so the bar is higher when it comes to making assertions, true assertions. I thought you would make the move that comes with a lower bar for believing your friend. After all, if someone is your friend, you know that they have very good reason, stronger reason than with a stranger, not to lie. So if someone asserts something who's your friend, I think on the first order level, you will need less evidence to believe that person than in the case of a stranger. And so I could summarize this as follows. The stronger the bond between S and A, the stronger the practical reason for S to tell the truth, and therefore the more likely that S will tell the truth, and thus the lower the evidential bar for A's believing S. Thus, I would say, let me see, knowledge of more practical reason to tell the truth about P translate to less epistemic reasons needed to believe that P. So in that particular sense, there is first order epistemic partiality. I would like to stress, though, that that would not count as some variety of pragmatic encroachment, because it's not so much the practical considerations that make a difference. The practical considerations involved, someone's being your friend, make a difference to epistemic reasons, right? And to epistemic norms. Because someone is your friend, you have good reason, given the same first order evidence, you have more reason to think that that person will actually tell the truth. So I thought, couldn't you explain this away, the challenge here, by saying there is, in some sense, partiality on a first order level, even though there is not on a second order level, because practical reasons make a difference to second order epistemic or evidential reasons. So that would be my suggestion. And I think that is compatible with some of the other things you actually say, but it would be an additional way to make sense of this challenge, to meet this challenge. And a third and final question that I wanted to ask you has to do with the exact proper treatment. So what kinds of pressure are relevant to proper treatment in response to assertion? So what I would like to suggest is, imagine that some person S testifies to someone else, an audience, at some specific time that P is true. Now I think you're right that there is epistemic pressure at that point in time, namely to adjust your exastic response to the evidence. And here what exactly the proper response is depends on your theory of testimony. And I think you're quite right about that. And I think you're also right that it depends on the interpersonal pressure from T onwards. So especially if someone is your friend, for instance, you may have a duty to seek further evidence, to double check, and so on, right? These practical duties that issue from it. But I thought there might be some third kind of interpersonal pressure related to assertions. And that has to do with interpersonal pressure prior to T. So imagine that assert to a friend of mine that I was at university yesterday, or that I didn't cheat on my wife, or anything like that. And imagine that a friend of mine does not believe me, even though I do provide good evidence, right? So it seems to me in that case, I am still wronged in some sense by that person, but not so much merely because of any sort of epistemic wrongs, right? And not so much maybe because of what I do from that moment onwards. But it might be the case that, I don't think this is always the case, but it might be the case that that friend of mine has not worked on relevant relation relevant cognitive faculties like trust and epistemic charity, open-mindedness, attentiveness, and so on, right? And so I've called these belief influencing factors on previous occasions. So you might think that if someone fails to believe you, even though you sincerely assert that P, what goes wrong is not merely that that person does not believe you and doesn't double check and so on, but that that person would have believed you if that person had worked on such belief influencing factors, right? So had been more attentive to you in the past, had listened better, had been more open-minded to you, or had been more trusting as a friend, and so on. So my question here is, isn't the relevant sort of pressure not merely the epistemic pressure and the interpersonal pressure starting at T, but also certain kinds of pressure, and they might be hard to define, but things, belief influencing factors prior to T that make a difference to A's dixastic response at T. So don't we need to appeal to those factors to fully explain whether a dixastic response is proper at some point in time T? All right, those were 3 questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rik. Again, as with Breno, I really appreciate the thoughtfulness and the time that you devoted to these to this argument. You make 3 points. I want to try to respond to them in turn. The first point is, what exactly is a proper response to a speaker? What exactly is the kind of proper treatment a speaker can expect in virtue of telling someone something? What's interesting is that the quotes up there, deserving of trust, should be careful before disbelieving. Those things are in the literature, and I think they're all wrong. So many people will say, when I tell you something, I'm deserving of trust. I don't actually think that's true. I don't think that people, merely in virtue of telling you something, are deserving of trust. There's a lovely book I cannot recommend highly enough by Catherine Hawley, a recent book on trust and trustworthiness. Catherine Hawley has a number of lovely suggestions, really insightful suggestions about trustworthiness, what makes a person trustworthy. And it turns out, and I think she agrees with me, that it's not merely in virtue of telling someone something that you're deserving of trust. So I actually agree with you, Rik, that those quoted passages at the top, that's not the right way to think about this. You make another nice point, which is that when you tell someone something, you often, especially if you're knowledgeable, you expect them to believe you, flat out believe you. And that suspension of judgment itself can be a wrong. You can feel wronged and properly feel wronged if somebody suspends judgment. I agree with you there as well. What do I think is the proper treatment that a speaker deserves? It's actually exactly your last bullet point. You need a proper degree of trust, proper degree of belief. That's belief tailored to the evidence that you have. In other work I didn't talk about it in this book, but in other work I've talked about the evidence that you should have had. You can complicate the picture if you want to bring in the evidence you should have had. But for the purpose of this book, my thought was, tailor your doxastic response to your evidence. And it's the evidence that dictates what kind of doxastic response, what degree of belief you ought to have in what they say. I actually think that this is the view that Miranda Fricker sometimes expresses in her book, and sometimes doesn't express in her book. My worry about Miranda, and the reason I focus on her is because I should be honest, she's the hero of this story. In my book, she actually is the person who comes closest to getting at what proper treatment consists in. I hypothesize and speculate that when she goes wrong, when she doesn't stick to this view, this is the view that I like, she doesn't stick to the view because she's overly committed to a particular, what I regard as slightly idiosyncratic conception of testimony, which is known in the literature as the assurance view of testimony. These are people like Hinchman and Moran and others. They are people who think that the mere act of telling the proper way to respond to that is by presuming the trustworthiness of the speaker. And they think that that follows merely from the act of telling itself. And I go to some length in the book to argue that if it's true that you ought to give the presumption of trustworthiness to a speaker, it's not because of the speech act, the nature of the speech act of telling, it's for some other reasons. And so you and I think, are on the same page there. Let's go to the second point that you make. You point out that isn't there a kind of first order epistemic partiality in friendship? Your thought is something like this, that when I know that it's my friend who's telling me this, and when I know that she values the friendship as I do, then I know that she has extra reasons practical reasons to speak truthfully to me, not to lie or speak unwarrantedly. Then it might well be that that lowers the bar for my accepting what she says. And I want to agree with most of what you said here and disagree with your gloss on what you said here. I want to agree with the following. When you and I are friends, and I know that you value our friendship, and I know the form that valuing takes, that is, I know that you're not going to lead me astray by lying or speaking unwarrantedly. That gives, you have strong practical reasons not to lie or speak unwarrantedly. And I know that about you. My knowing that about you is itself evidence that you're not going to lie or speak unwarrantedly. That's an epistemic reason on my part. This is what Breno was talking about when he talked about the transition from practical reasons to epistemic reasons. I think what that means is you've got a lot more epistemic reasons pertaining to your friends than you do to your non-friends. So it's not a matter of lowering the bar, quite the contrary. It's a matter of the bar being exactly where it is, but you just have a lot more reasons. Reasons that derive from your recognition that your friend values the friendship. I should say here my view is not original. Again, I like to mention her a lot because I'm inspired by her work. Catherine Hawley has a piece in Synthèse a few years back where she makes precisely this point. And I think I mentioned this in the book. It's just that we have a lot more evidence that our friends are about our friends, and we think our friends actually value us and wouldn't lie to us. That's a difference maker between our friends and other people, because we don't know that about other people. So I think I accept the beginning part of what you said there, but I don't accept the gloss. I don't accept the idea that it lowers the if you like, however you put it, it lowers the threshold for our believing them. Let me go to the third point that you made. What exactly is proper treatment? You actually suggest something in addition to what I had in the book. I am perfectly happy to accept what you added, but I wonder whether it's something that goes beyond the scope of the book. Because in the book, what I was trying to figure out is what, in virtue of a speaker's having performed that particular speech act, entitles her to expect proper treatment. And I'm inclined to think that what you're pointing out, these belief influencing factors, the kind of factors that you wrote about in your very lovely book on responsible belief, what you're pointing out are things that, as it were, we typically expect of everyone independent of conversations. We just expect each other to live up to certain minimal threshold of epistemic competence, is the way that I would put it. I think you're quite right about that, but I wonder whether that's usefully framed in terms of the kinds of normative pressures that arise in context of conversation. If they arise in context of conversation, it's only because they arise everywhere, conversation being a special case of everywhere. So while I agree with you, I guess I'm not sure that it's the fact that it's missing from this account actually is noteworthy, and I'm hoping I can get you to agree with me on that. But if not, I do agree with you on this. I do think you're absolutely right. I think you were right in your book, and I think you're right here to point out that we do expect one another to live up to certain, I would call them very, very minimal thresholds of epistemic competence. You might actually think it's higher than what I think it is, but we agree on the basic point that we have these expectations of one another. So I will leave it at that. And again, Rik, I want to thank you very much for your extraordinarily thoughtful comments and challenges.
Thank you, Sandy. I think we should continue with our third critic, Charity. Would you like to give your comment now?
Yes, I'd be very happy to. Well, I want to echo the other commentators in my thanks for being invited to participate in this great session. And it's really wonderful to be able to do some philosophy from home in a time like this. And I'm really, really grateful to participate. So I have a sort of cluster of comments, and they are all directed at chapter 2. So I thought I'd just start by mentioning the way that you so clearly distinguish between these different moments of a conversation. So Sandy distinguishes between the moment of address, the moment of performance and uptake, and then the uptake of uptake. And so I'm going to be focusing on the moment of address. And Sandy says that it's the fact of address that puts pressure on the audience to attend, and that address itself transforms the situation into one in which the audience owes the speaker his or her attention. And in this way, the act generates a normative expectation. And his core contention is that this expectation, this normative expectation, is grounded in our status as rational social creatures with the need to cooperate with others. And because of this, we have a need for a mechanism by which to initiate these attempts at cooperation. And address is supposed to be this mechanism by which we demand or make someone else owe us their attention, at least for the time it takes for me to manifest my intention. So I have a couple questions about this, and I think in many ways they're just a request to get you to clarify or elaborate a little bit more on some specific things that you say in this chapter. So first, I want to point to one example in the section where you're responding to potential objections. So you're talking about some situations where you say there might be doubt about whether an address generates a claim on someone's attention. And you distinguish between misuses and abuses. So misuses are the ones, or situations where someone unintentionally is uncooperative, and abuses are where they are intentionally cooperative. And I think sort of the gist of my question here has to do with some of the complexities involved in determining whether or not someone's intentionally or unintentionally uncooperative, and also whether they're cooperative or uncooperative, but we'll get to that. So I want to focus on this case of impracticably many addresses. So just to remind everyone what the case is, the pop star Madonna is leaving her apartment, and all of her fans sort of swarm her at once, asking for her attention in some way. And on the assumption that these are addresses, I know you mentioned that maybe they're not, but on the assumption that these are addresses, what you say is that she knows that they know that the prospect of serious engagement is nil. So it would not be reasonable for the fans to intend to initiate a cooperative action that's more demanding than what would require maybe merely her, turning her head to glance at them or giving them a little nod or something. So the idea is that if they initiate something that would demand more, they are being uncooperative. And I wonder about this. So what I'm wondering about specifically is that it seems to presume that it's fairly easy to know when initiating cooperation is too demanding or inappropriate, and when it's appropriate. And that it's also easy to know as the recipient when our addressee knows this. And I thought this might be a little too idealized. So it seems to involve the accurate judgment of the likelihood of a cooperation on the part of the addresser. And even though in the Madonna case, I agree, I think that this is a kind of an easy case where it should be pretty easy for them to judge what the likelihood is that she's going to stop and actually have a conversation with them. But I worry that in more complicated cases, this is going to place a fairly unreasonable demand on the addressee. because it involves knowing in advance what the likelihood of cooperation is, and that we can't really expect people to make accurate judgments about this. And so I worry that even though in this case the reply may succeed, that it's relying on this more background principle that's a little bit too demanding. And I think the problem isn't just that there are cases where it's difficult to judge, but also that it's okay for us to expect to fail sometimes, and that even when we think it's unlikely we'll succeed, it might be okay for us to initiate anyways. So I'm thinking that cooperation just involves a lot of unknowns. And I think we can see this in a lot of different areas. So if you think about friendships, I might want to be your friend, someone else, you might not want to be my friend, and I might try to initiate something that you don't reciprocate, or in, this or obviously occurs in dating relationships, but that it's sort of expected that we're going to fail at times. And it's not clear to me that that means I'm being uncooperative if someone were to sort of put themselves out there like that, even with the low likelihood of success. And I know you mentioned that there's also all of these nonverbal practices we've developed in order to signal when we're interested, when we're not interested. But it also strikes me that these fail, and these fail a lot of the time. And there's lots of stories and movies made about these failures where we're not good at interpreting a lot of these signals or at giving these signals. And so I thought it might be a little too optimistic to rely on those kinds of signals to make these kinds of cooperative or uncooperative exchanges easy. This relates to a broader thought I have about cooperation. So you mentioned that what's generating this obligation to attend is our interest in cooperation insofar as we are social creatures. And one question I had that is, how far does this extend, and what do we need to cooperate for exactly? So clearly I don't have an interest in cooperating with everyone for every purpose. And maybe I just simply don't want to cooperate. Maybe it's not that I'm busy or, have these overriding reasons. Maybe I just really don't want to. And they don't know that. It's not clear to me that my status as a rational social creature is going to be enough to make it such that I should cooperate. So I have a kind of a broad question about the scope of being cooperative. And I know that you place limits on what it is that we owe one another to suggest that, it is fairly minimal. I know you don't think that we owe someone an hour conversation, that maybe sometimes just attending for a second would be enough. And that you grant that there's lots of exceptions for when we would be entitled to expect someone to cooperate, or when we would owe someone our attention. But here's a worry I have, and I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here for a moment, so take this as an invitation to clarify. But I worry that you have this account that says if someone addresses you, you owe them attention, and you spell it out really clearly, and so much of it is very compelling. But I worry that in all of the qualifications, it gets watered down a bit. So here's an analogy to try to communicate what I have in mind. If we were to start off with saying something like, well, if you go to a museum, everyone owes them a donation. But then we were to say, oh, but you know what? By donation, actually, I meant like 5 cents, something very, very minimal. And then, oh yeah, and if you don't have 5 cents on you in exact change, you don't owe it. And pretty soon we've got so many exceptions that I wonder sort of whether the initial suggestion is just much less substantive. So I was just curious to hear maybe some of your thoughts on that. Okay, so the second broad well, the second and last broad comment that I wanted to raise has to do again with the basis of normativity of address that requires that S initiate a conversation by calling on the speaker and then the audience owing their minimal attention. And you think that the addresser can expect acknowledgement. Now, this is something that I was thinking about as I read this chapter again and again, is that our attention is a really valuable resource. And we have tons of competition for our attention. I think especially with cell phones, all the different ways that people have to get our attention, I find myself constantly fighting to, push things aside in order to focus. And I really value being able to focus and being able to set aside things that might ask for my attention. And I think some of the ways in which people call for our attention, they aren't entitled to, so maybe telemarketers would come to mind. And you discuss a wide variety of examples here, but I wanted to see if you could say just a bit more about texting and calling on the phone. So you mentioned that there may be a difference between something like email and face-to-face encounters, but I didn't see it. It's possible I missed it. You clearly come out and say that these sources do not generate a reason to respond. And so I was wondering what you would say about this, because texting and calling certainly seem to be attempts to initiate coordination. But there does seem to be a real difference between what we were going to say about those cases and a face-to-face encounter. So I agree with you that, if I drop my phone and someone tries to get my attention, clearly it would be very rude of me to ignore them. But I ignore texts all the time from strangers, but from people that I know as well. And so there seem to be very different norms and very different standards around calling and texting, and they also seem to vary a lot more person to person, even within a culture. And so I wanted to just invite you to speak to that point.
Charity, thank you so much. I am so delighted that you focused on this chapter and that you really press me on these matters. I think your questions are just pushing on all of the right places that are places that need more to be said, and also places where, quite honestly, there might be some challenges, unmet challenges that remain from the book. Let me see if I can try to respond. I actually took you to be making 4 different points. Let me see if I can respond to each one of them in turn. Let me start with your last one, because it's one that I have become obsessed with, so I really appreciate your questions. What to say about text, phone calls? Let me give one short, very brief story. So my mother has a very, very strange practice that she thinks that whenever her cell phone rings, she has to answer it. That strikes me as wrong. So question, why is it you Charity, correctly point out, when you call someone, you're trying to get their attention. So what's the difference? So my thought is that all of these norms derive from what I describe, I think in the introduction of the book, as the, in the first instance, the mutuality of speech exchanges. Mutuality plays a very, very large role for me, as I think it did for Grice and for many others who think about this. So my thought is this: the person who calls you on the phone has no idea what you're doing. If you're otherwise occupied, as I point out, if I'm otherwise occupied, somebody walks up to me and it's clear that I'm doing something, that's rude to address me. In fact, there are norms on proper address. So my thought is, precisely because it's common knowledge that you have no idea what the person on the other line is doing, you can't make a claim on their attention right now. You can't do that because it's common knowledge that you don't know whether they're otherwise occupied. Once you answer the phone, however, you're in a different situation. So I think the same thing is true of texts. It's interesting, in our community, we seem to think that we have to respond to texts more quickly, or prioritize them over emails. I'm not exactly sure I can explain why that is. That may be a function just of the younger generation. I'm not sure, but my kids tell me very clearly that if somebody texts you, that takes priority over email. So I don't think, here's an area where I'm going to say to you, spot on. I don't know that I've got a good explanation for that. I'd love to know what the explanation for why we prioritize text over email. I was also fascinated by letter writing. I think letter writing has the same thing. When somebody gets the letter, you can't tell exactly what situation they're in. There's less of, if you like, a thick mutuality in those kinds of situations. So that's what I want to say about those kinds of cases. Let me now move to the first thing that you remarked on. Really rich set of comments. Is my theory too demanding? The theory that says when a person addresses another, in so doing, as long as she's cooperative, she makes, as it were, a demand on the attention of the addressee. Is it too demanding? Your worry is that as I've handled the impractically many addresses case, the case of Madonna, I am assuming, and you're quite right, you called me out correctly on this, I am assuming that there's going to be a lot of things that are mutual knowledge, including when it's reasonable to ask for my attention and when it's not reasonable. Your worry is that this may be too demanding. So I want to say two things here. One, my theory makes the following prediction. In the cases you describe where someone actually makes a mistake and thinks something is reasonable when it's not, my theory predicts they're likely to go normatively wrong. They're likely to do something that my theory will condemn them for. It's a further question whether that's the right verdict. I'm inclined to think that I'm going to go with my theory here. So I'm inclined to think that when it renders these kinds of verdicts, I'll go with the theory. Your worry then takes the form of there are going to be too many verdicts that say you're normatively deficient. And I'm inclined to think that we may be better at this than you worry. I don't know this literature well. It's a literature I'm just getting into, but there's a lovely literature on how the fact that we're social creatures gives us these mind reading competences that go way beyond the other primates and so on and so forth. I'm inclined to think we do a lot better at this than one might think. At the same time, I think you're right that there will be many cases like the kind you describe. And what I'd love to do, and again, I'm going to say this, I should have said this to Rik as well, I'll say this to you. I'd love to follow up afterwards if you think that you've got really nice cases where I'm saying I'll endorse the verdict and you say, no, that's not a good verdict to endorse, because I'm inclined to think when my theory makes those verdicts, I will endorse them. So I in a way that's pleading guilty to the charge, but say it's not as bad as you think. How far does the expectation extend? That's a really lovely question. I'm often accused of being hypersensitive to the demands others make on me. And so I've been accused of being overly moralizing with respect to what I ought to be doing. That may or may not be true, but my thought is, at the very least, and I'm hoping, Charity, you agree with me on this, at the very least, when someone addresses you, you will feel bad if you do not attend to them at all, if you ignore them. That's the datum that I'm trying to capture. That's, I think, the reflection of the kind of thing that I'm talking about in this chapter. At the same time, there are all sorts of ways in which we address one another, even in mutual cases where we think that that the addressor has no claim. So what I wanted to say is, when it is cooperative, what you owe is at least enough attention to discern what the intent of the addressor actually is. And I added that, absent other information, all of us ought to presume the cooperativity of others. What that actually allows me to address your third point is isn't this too watered down? I do allow lots of exceptions, lots of cases where a person addresses. So here's my thought, and again, I would love to know whether you agree with this. My thought is, I actually put the burden on the audience. The audience has to, in the absence of reasons one way or the other, you ought to attend. However, if you have reasons to think that there's something fishy going on here, you can get off the hook. So that's the sense in which I don't think this is so minimal, because it's a strong default. If you're going to ignore me, you better have a reason. That's the idea. I think I think that gets at all four of your points. Again, Charity, I would love to know your thoughts and where you think my responses were insufficient. And I also want to thank you, as I was thanking the two previous speakers, for the clear thoughtfulness that you brought to this. I'm really grateful to you for that.
Thank you. So Amy Flowerree will now take on the last comment.
Hello, and I hope you feel like that's the saying of 2020. I'm so delighted to be here and to be with some of my favorite philosophers. Seeing you is a real highlight of these COVID times. Thanks especially to Waldemiro for the invitation, and Sibel, and I think Lewis is on here too for setting everything up, and to Concept for hosting, and most importantly to Sandy for his lovely book that I really enjoyed reading and will continue to be mulling on. These are topics that he and I have talked about, and I find it so exciting and illuminating. Charity and I were on the same bandwidth when it came to figuring out what we wanted to talk about. So I hope that this isn't going to duplicate too much from what Charity was saying. I think I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. So here I have, I just think this helps a little bit for describing things. So I have a PowerPoint just to keep track of the points. So I also am focusing on chapter 2, and I also am focusing on the normative pressure that arises from an address, from a speaker to an address. And so the 3 points that I want to hit on are how to be a responsible addressee, like what do we owe other people? And I mean this not in the sense of like, Sandy, exactly whether your theory will predict that that this person has done something wrong, but more just like if I am a deeply responsible person and I want to be attuned to the people around me, what kind of considerations should I be sensitive to? And then the second question, and this is really a lot of what you were responding to, Charity, and I think she read you as potentially having all these exceptions that watered down the conditions under which the addressee owes response to the speaker. And I read it as extremely demanding, which I guess was one of the reasons she offered as well. So I'm going to also probe at this point and hopefully have a clearer sense of your claims here. And then the third point is about some initiations for joint cooperative projects seem to require not just that they are cooperative and respectful, but something that I'm going to call standing. It's like not appropriate to initiate a certain kind of joint project unless you have the appropriate standing to do that with that person. Not just qua rational thinker, but like qua particular relationship. Okay, so those are the 3 points that I'm going to raise. The first one has to do with responsibility. So Sandy, your point is that our default should be to attend to the speaker's address unless it's disrespectful or uncooperative. But many times we will not be in any position to assess whether the address is disrespectful or uncooperative until we've heard them out. So of course the view is, well, then we should default to assuming it's fine. And there might be places where we could responsibly ignore the person, but because we don't know yet that if we're responsible addressees, we will listen. So they're like, hey, I need to talk to you. I'm now at the end of term, so I'm getting all of these student emails, which isn't in person, but you know, hey, I need to talk to you. And I'm like, Some of them are not things that I need to be addressing at this moment. Okay, so here's the question. How would an addressee that wants to be responsible behave under conditions where it is permissible to ignore the addresses, but she isn't in a position to appreciate this until the opportunity to ignore has passed? So, you know, a lot of my examples here are going to be COVID-related ones where it's like, mom, 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 mom. It's like, I don't know until I find out what my child is asking, whether this is something that I can clearly ignore. And maybe, you know, parenting is, there's less that I can ignore, but there's still some that I can ignore. But the opportunity to ignore it has passed because I don't yet know. So this is, again, a question about how to be a responsible addressee in conversation and what exactly we should be sensitive to and at what point we can just sort of back away. And this is just a question, it's not an objection. The second point that I want to make is about So in your interacting with charity, you really forefronted the notion of cooperativity, the cooperative part. And that is a huge part of your account, but there's also this part of respect. And my thought is that the respect and the cooperativity can pull apart in really important ways, where our normative, or not, maybe not, let's not say normative, but our predictive expectations are generated by these practices and social norms that we're a part of. But those practices themselves are disrespectful. And so this is really asking for you to clarify and maybe explain a little the way these two things might go, where it's like it is in some sense recognized as a cooperative project, and it is one in which there are certain predictive expectations that go along, but it is not, in fact, a respectful practice. And so the one that I want to sort of pull, well, okay, let me say the bit about respect first. So maybe you have a different notion of respect in mind, but I'm just going to throw out there two things that I've thought about a lot. So what you give as a rational principle is rational agents owe each other respect. And there's, of course, this Kantian principle of humanity, which is never treat oneself or others as a mere means, but also as an end. So the idea that as mutual ends givers, I can't just assume that you can be like an object that does things for my will. You have to be also an end setter, that I respect your ability to opt in or opt out. And then the second one, and I have been working on developing this one, which I think also comes out of a Kantian kind of notion of respect, which is that part of respect requires deferring to every rational being's right to put forward reasons or shape cooperative action in some way. So we can't just ignore someone's contribution to a joint action. We have to take into account what they want. So these are the two things I was thinking of, and neither one clearly grounds this right to be responded to when you have an address, but maybe you have more to say about this, so I invite you to say more. And there's, as you mentioned, cooperative activities, and then I actually just added this as you were talking to Charity, this reasonable expectations for when someone can reply. So there's these strong social norms about what you can expect of the other person, and this all goes into when address requires response. Okay, so I'm going to talk about catcalling, of course. So there is a section in your book where you talk about this, and the upshot of it was both on Gricean cooperation principles and, or perhaps this was the same point, I wasn't entirely clear, on respect, from the standpoint of respect, catcalling is disrespectful and so does not require a response. It's sort of outside the domain of forms of address that require a response. I wasn't totally clear on why it violated some kind of cooperation principle. And I think some of this is because, like, at this moment in time, we recognize that catcalling is really disrespectful and awful and not a practice that should be allowed to continue. But I was thinking, like, what if we just go back in time? It's like 1980s catcalling, where it's so normalized that no one would even understand when a woman's like, I will not respond to this. Like, there would be no public sense of awareness of why a woman would find this offensive, and her attempts to explain it would be met with like kind of a bafflement. And this is where I feel like the cooperation and the expectations might come apart from respect, because it's still disrespectful in the 1980s when nobody recognizes it as such. But currently, but let's suppose we're in the 1980s where the practices just shape these expectations that this is a fine and normal thing to happen. And it seems like the person who engages in the catcalling would feel, feels really huffy when they don't get the smile or they don't get the whatever that they wanted. And in that culture, there wouldn't be any kind of social reinforcement of like, what's wrong with you, dude? It would be more like, oh yeah, she should have smiled or something like that. Okay, so that's on catcalling. And then I think there's this nearby version that I'll call catcalling star, where it's like, it's not demeaning or inherently disrespectful. It's just like, like, oh, I've had people, this has not happened to me, but I've had people report to me that this had happened to them. It's like, hey, beautiful, will you marry me? Where it's said out of admiration, it's not clearly disrespectful, but on the other hand, the woman owes nothing in response. So I was curious what you would say to that, where it's not clearly disrespectful, it's just, no, she doesn't have to respond to that. It seems to me. Seems like it ought to be ignored, but it's not straightforwardly disrespectful or straightforwardly non-cooperative. At least that's my thought. So I'm interested in your response to that. And then we have, and I kind of, now that from your reaction to Charity, I kind of know what you're going to say for this one. But we have people who don't respond and don't seem to owe a response. So the Buckingham Palace guards, tourists come and ask them about directions. According to their job description, they shouldn't respond to anything. I presume they would respond to the Queen or something, but they don't respond to tourists. And so there's like lots of videos of people. And some of this you can say, well, that's not cooperative. They're just being silly. They're just trying to like get them to break character. But let's suppose the tourist doesn't know and they come by and they're like, hey, is this Buckingham Palace? No response. Seems like the guard has not wronged or doesn't have a reason to respond just because of that. So I'm curious about what your reaction to this case is. I don't think they're wronging the tourists, even if the tourist was sincerely taking themselves to be in a cooperative endeavor of like, you know, why the funny hat or something. Okay. And then here's one last one, and this is really tracking the question about respect, whether respect is necessary for your address to be required to require response. So I'm thinking of, and again, I said too many COVID examples. This is another one. So Shauna is a member of a disadvantaged group who's historically not listened to. And there's a long track record of her speech individually and collectively based on her group membership being ignored. So one day she's in a meeting where the company is discussing COVID-related work from home procedures, and she realizes that the work from home policies have completely untenable implications for parents. So employees are not permitted to have their children in the room while they're on camera. They're not permitted to leave their desks during work hours except for specified bathroom breaks. And as a parent who is about to go home and have no childcare, she recognizes that this is completely impossible. So she tries to get attention on Zoom, and it's not really having uptake. At last, she just goes ballistic on the meeting, right? She's shouting and talking over people and saying, you guys are all evil. Okay, so not good behavior on behalf of Shauna, we can say. Like, that wasn't the most wise response, that wasn't the most respectful response. But it seems like her colleagues still owe her uptake. They owe her address because of the way they've treated her in the past. So even though she's disrespectful and in some sense non-cooperative in this particular exchange, because they were previously in a bad position, suddenly that's not a problem. So I'm interested in your take on this case. Okay, I think that's all I have on the respect point. So I have one final point. And that is that whether some forms of address initiating some cooperative projects require special standing. So here I think of like really personal questions like, are you trans? Are you pregnant? How much do you weigh? Most people cannot ask these questions. They're deeply inappropriate. And so it seems like in order to be in the position to even engage somebody with like a joint endeavor of talking about some issue or discovering something about them or anything like that, you really have to stand in an appropriate relationship, not just the general rational being relationship. And the other is like big decisions. Like you can't just ask anyone to marry you. It should be, they don't owe you an answer if you ask them to marry you, you know, I don't know, like, and maybe you would say it isn't sincere, I don't know, but you could imagine somebody, maybe the Kierkegaard Knight of Faith who's so in love with the princess, though he's never met her. Will you marry me? No, you don't have standing to ask for that. And then the other one is, and this follows up with some of Charity's things about like the persistence level. And it's easier to see this in texts, phone calls, and emails, but it happens in person too, where, you know, you didn't reply, so you did a bad. So they ask again. And let's just say, after once or twice of asking, like it seems rude for them to keep asking for your attention unless there's some specific special standing that is at stake here. Okay, so that's all I have. Mainly the 3 points were just whether it required special standing, whether respect and cooperation and these two things could pull apart, and what do we say when they do. And the first one, which I'm blanking on, oh yes, the responsibilities for a very responsible FRC. Okay, thank you.
So Amy, as with the others, I want to thank you so much for really, really thoughtful and challenging questions. And as I said to Charity, I'm also delighted that you found chapter 2 worthy of chewing on and objecting to, because this is, thinking about address is one of the things that really has obsessed me. So let me see if I can address your three comments in order. Actually, let me start with your last comment, standing, because I really like that question. I want to distinguish two things, and I hope this is familiar to all of you. I want to distinguish between the question, does a person need a standing to address another? And does the person need a standing to ask a particular question of another? The arguments that you gave are arguments, at least several of them, that appeal to examples of the standing to ask a question. You're absolutely correct. Lots of times questions would be rude or inappropriate, or you know what, you're not in a position to ask me that. I agree entirely with you. Let me focus on the standing to make an active address. The reason that we need to pull these apart is that I think you know this, Amy, but oftentimes the way you address someone is in the very act of asking the question. And so there is no disentangling the two. And in fact, the one really lovely discussion outside of ethics, the one lovely discussion that I've seen in the literature on address is from Quill Kukla's and Mark Lance's Yo and Lo, where in fact what they're interested in is if you like, the act of address in the speech act itself. What I try to argue is that we should not think that the answers to that question, who has the standing to ask a question, are automatically going to be answers to the question, who has the standing to address. And I hope you'll agree with me on this, that whereas it is absolutely inappropriate to ask a person about his, her, or their sexuality, and that you need standing to do that, maybe the intimacy of a friend, it is not inappropriate to address someone in order to want to start a conversation. It may well be that the conversation you imagine that you're going to have is inappropriate, but I still think that addressing people actually is a different matter than asking them those questions. Nevertheless, maybe you need standing to address. Kukla and Lance in that lovely book, Yo and Lo, actually, that is the way they approach address, that people do need a standing to address. I think that's wrong for reasons that I hope I can spell out briefly. But my thought is this. They give lots of examples where there's great cultural variation in who can address whom, when, and under what circumstances. And I'm inclined to think that even if that's true, and that is true, I mean, they're right about that, that should be seen as something that happens, as it were, subsequent to a capacity or a right is too loaded a word, but I'm going to use it anyway, a right that we all have to call on the attention of others. In other words, I want to see the right that we all have to call on the attention of others as basic, and then cultures can constrain that as they see fit. You can certainly introduce social norms that constrain that, but I want to see that right as basic. And the reason I want to is precisely because I think this gets to your first really lovely question. I see us as creatures that, because we are social, we need to cooperate. That means we are going to need a way of capturing each other's attention, if only long enough to propose these cooperative endeavors. I want to say that's part of our, if you like, our human being. That's what it is to be a human. And it may well be that you then grow up in a community that actually wants to restrict that, but that actually is an inheritance that you have as a human being, namely a social, rational creature. Really lovely point you make, and I have not thought about this, and I'm going to just think of this off the top of my head, so I could be wrong, Amy. This will be another case where I'm learning from you to a degree that's I just owe you a lot of gratitude. You point out, wait a second, there are two moving parts here. There's cooperativity and there's respect. They can pull apart. Lovely, lovely point. What I really want, the principle that I want to be doing most of the heavy lifting is the cooperativity. I was thinking I could bring in respect, although I haven't thought about this carefully enough, so I appreciate your pushing me on this. I was thinking I could bring in respect because I thought that along with being creatures that need to cooperate with one another, there will be a natural kind of respect that we all owe to one another, namely the sort of respect that's owed to someone who can in principle initiate a cooperative action or propose to initiate a cooperative action with others. So thinking off the top of my head, my thought is cooperativity is the basic notion. Respect, there's going to be a kind of respect that's appropriate for contexts in which we're thinking about the prospect of cooperative action. And that's the kind of respect that I'm appealing to. But it's to be understood in terms of this basic notion of cooperativity. It would not surprise me in the least if, in fact, that account does not fully address your question. So I'm going to say the same thing to you that I said to Charity and to Breno and to Rik, and that is I really would welcome you to follow up afterwards and let me know that this doesn't exactly work. Let's, as a test case, let's take your 1980s catcall case. By the way, you are seriously dating me. I just want you to know that because I was around in the 1980s and I was old enough to think about these things. But think about these things, you know, what to say about, so I'm imagining your case looks like this, that no one yet complains about the catcalls, that there's a common practice. Maybe the women who complain about this catcall practice actually get criticized. Hey, this is a practice, we all do this. So your thought is, look, if that's an up and going practice, then that practice demands a kind of as long as it's up and going, that practice demands a kind of cooperativity, in which case, isn't it, if you ground everything in cooperativity, doesn't my theory deliver the wrong results, namely that the women owe the men a response? I take it that's the criticism. Okay, so something I did not argue for in this book, but I have argued for in the 2018 book, to the best of our knowledge, is the idea that not all practices are legitimate. And what I would hope to do, this is an IOU because I haven't done it. I have to think about this more in light of your question. What I would hope to do is explain that there can be constraints on when a practice is considered legitimate. I would hope that I could appeal to a notion of cooperativity to do so, where the notion of cooperativity is basically a cooperative situation is a situation where both you and I stand to gain from our mutual engagement with one another in ways that should be mutually obvious to both of us. My hope, this is an IOU because I haven't done the hard lifting, would be to say that catcalling in the 1980s was not cooperative in this sense, even though that it was an up and going practice. Having said that, that's a huge IOU, so I want to thank you for flagging that because that's work I haven't done. Let me come back lastly to your one point about, so two other points, disadvantaged minority and then the mom case. Disadvantaged minority, lovely example. This also goes to a point that somebody made previously that I did not adequately respond to. It may have been Charity, in which case I apologize to you, Charity. Aren't there cases where we should think about people as occupying certain social roles? And isn't that relevant to the kinds of normative expectations there are? I'm inclined to think the answer is yes. And the way I want to think about this is exactly as I told you earlier. I want to think that the basic human level is a level of cooperativity where we can presume these things of each other. And then what happens is, as we evolve and live in particular communities, there are social norms that get built on them. And sometimes those social norms are bad norms. They're norms that are improper norms. The theory that I haven't come up with yet, but which I just talked about, would have to say why those are improper. Then my thought is this: she was wronged, and she is responding to a wrong, and it's perfectly appropriate for her to respond to a wrong. I'm inclined to think that actually she's not being rude when she starts getting upset with people. In fact, lots of conversations these days, conversations in the big sense, if you think about it, I mean, I'm sure this is what motivated you, Amy. A lot of oppressed groups are right now behaving in ways that I sometimes hear, well, they're just being disrespectful and rude. And I want to say, in many of these cases, no, you're getting it wrong. They're responding to a prior wrong that we committed. So it's not disrespectful or rude for these more attention-grabbing or otherwise very, very assertive ways of capturing attention. I want to be able to say that, and I think that's compatible with the idea that everyone deserves attention when they make the address, and that they're responding to not having been attended to earlier on. Again, you will tell me if there's something that I'm missing there, and it's quite possible that there is. The mom case is one that I have to tell you I've thought about as well, albeit as dad. But my thought there, I mean, I don't have much more to say about this because you actually correctly talked about my view. That's one of the reasons why I distinguished, and Charity pointed this out, between misuses of the practice and abuses. I tend to think that young kids aren't abusing the practice, they're misusing it. And I made that distinction precisely because I think that a responsible addressee will differentiate her responses according to whether it is a misuse or an abuse. An abuse, ignore it. Draw your inferences about how awful that person is. When it's misuse, what I argued in the book, we ought to educate people. And that does involve actually giving them more than perhaps is their due in an attempt to initiate them into the practice that we, the normatively sanctioned practice that you and I participate in. And that's why I think when the kid is mom, 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 it is annoying as all hell. And I think we owe it to them, not merely because they're misusing rather than abusing, but as you correctly pointed out, because we are their parents and we have duties of care, if you like, because we're their parents. But I've spoken a lot, and I just want to say, Amy, again, I count myself in a weird way to be a person who has learned so much from you over the years about normativity and about how epistemic reasons and practical reasons play with one another. And I want to say I appreciate this as an opportunity to learn from you again. So I look forward to our following up, and thank you so much for your lovely comments.
Thank you, everyone, for your valuable contributions, and especially Sandy for giving us the chance to comment on your book. And I think all of us enjoyed the discussion a lot, and I hope very much our viewers did too. And you can leave us a comment in the comment section below if you like. And if you want to stay tuned on the upcoming episodes of Philosopher Meets Critics or other events by Concept, you can visit concept-phil.de. And I assume that our viewers want to buy your book right away. So I think we'll just leave a link in the comment below, in the section, description section below. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for
That's
joining.
wonderful. Sibel, let me just say one last thank you to you, one last thank you to Waldo, and also one last thank you to Breno, to your institution for supporting this, and the four critics. You are the best. You are the reason that I continue to love philosophy. And thank you so much for your thoughtfulness. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So see you. See you soon. Bye.